Well, a bit like buses, you wait a long time for a new series and then two come along at once. We had a new one this morning, started to look at some of the miracles of Jesus Christ. And this evening I want to start a new series looking at the life of King Hezekiah. The rather unsnappy title I've got for this series is simply Good King Hezekiah. God willing, this will comprise about 7 or 8 messages, but we'll see how we go, and that will take us through to sometime in the middle of this year, God willing. But why Hezekiah? What is it about the life of a king who ruled just 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel some 2,500 years ago that warrants or merits our attention? A long time ago in my previous church, I sat in the vestry and I was talking with one of the elders, and I said to him that I'd wanted to, and I'd been thinking about doing a series on the life of Hezekiah. And I could see in his face and body what he said, that he wasn't entirely overwhelmed or convinced about the idea. But he later reflected on it and he encouraged me, and he said, well, when you started talking about this and about Hezekiah, you suddenly became very animated and excited. Well, that was 8 years ago, and finally I've got around to this series that I've long wanted to do. I think the main reason for wanting to study his life is the empathy that we can perhaps feel towards this godly man living in desperate times. And just as we're perhaps drawn to Peter, who desired to serve Christ so much, and yet he just fell on his face all the time, didn't he? Got it wrong so many times. And so too we find in Hezekiah a man who clearly has a godly wish to serve his Lord, and yet makes so many mistakes. It's a man that we have much in common with, I think. And as we'll go on to see, he did make a lot of mistakes, some of them big mistakes. As with many men in the scriptures, he kind of lost his way in his later years. Yet at heart, he was a man who was raised to a high position, but demonstrated great faith and devotion and practical examples of godly leadership during a period in which all of those things were often very lacking amongst the kings of Israel and Judah. I should perhaps qualify the choice of my title when I said Good King Hezekiah. Of course, the Lord Jesus Christ said, there is none good except God. And we know that verse, don't we? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So my selection of this word to describe King Hezekiah is very much to be understood in the sense of a relative description rather than an absolute one. Of course, if we drew a sort of coloured timeline of the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah when they were divided into the 2 nations, we'd discover that the majority of our chart would be marked in black, and not for a good reason. During that 450-year period, from the reign of Saul to Zedekiah, when the kingdom ended in, I think, 587 BC, a long time ago. Even following that more godly line through the kings of Judah, over half of those kings were characterised by that terrible indictment, that they did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. And only a few men acquitted themselves favourably, including Hezekiah, of whom we read in verses 5 to 7 here. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor any that were before him. For he clave to the Lord and departed not from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord commanded Moses, and the Lord was with him. Do we want the Lord to be with us? Well, here's a man that can teach us something. If we would live godly lives, here's an example that we can draw encouragement and even correction from, perhaps, that we can certainly learn from. But we do well to remember right at the start here that Israel wasn't meant to have a king. It wasn't meant to have a king at all. From the death of Moses, the nation had been preserved from much folly and much sin by those prophets and judges that led Israel. And though those men were far from perfect, their leadership was under that ultimate authority of God, who had appointed them to that place. Because the people weren't satisfied with that. They wanted to be like everybody else. They wanted a king. And so they rejected the wisdom of God and followed the examples of those godless nations. And we should take heed from that very fact, shouldn't we? That sometimes the Lord gives his people what they want, even when it's not necessarily for their immediate good. We should be very careful what we ask God for. Samuel warned the people the consequences of rejecting God's rule. And of course the subsequent history, that sad history of Israel, proved the folly of the choice that they'd made. And though that pathway of decline wasn't completely straight, as it were, downwards, it was interrupted by revivals in the times of kings like Josiah and Hezekiah. Of course, that trend was inexorably downwards, leading ultimately to the captivity and the dispersal of Israel. But against that dark, almost black background, we nonetheless have these occasional bright flares, flashes of light. And just as a nation seems to have sunk to a new depth of depravity, God in his mercy raises up a king who doesn't walk in those ways. He doesn't follow the footsteps of his father, or indeed the nation in general. And again, such is a case that we have with Hezekiah. And I think we should draw great comfort from that. The gracious intervention of Almighty God in times of seemingly utter darkness. Perhaps today, I certainly feel it, I'm sure you do, that each new year just brings with it new depths of moral decay, rejection of those things which are true and honest and just and pure and lovely and of good report, those things that we're to seek after. And it just seems they're pushed aside, and new ways of doing evil are dreamt up. And it perhaps seems as though this once great nation is just sinking into godless obscurity. And when we're tempted to think like that, we should turn again, I think, to books like 1st and 2nd Kings and read again of the wonderful works of God, who's able to raise up a servant for himself in such a time, even as this, in our own day. Well, this evening I'm not going to speak on a particular text. We're going to be sort of starting in 2 Kings chapter 18. I simply tonight want to introduce this man to you and to draw out some general points from what the Bible tells us about him and the days in which he lived. What we're going to do tonight is going to be more than a history lesson, but nonetheless it is real history. And that's our first heading tonight, real history. In 2 Kings 20, verse 20, we read this: and the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, and all his might, and how he made a pool and a conduit, and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Those words have been known to the world ever since they were written 2,500 years ago or thereabouts. But that conduit that's spoken of there was unknown until relatively recently. In 1880, I believe it was, they found that conduit that's spoken of in the Bible. It was no ordinary thing. If you look on the internet when you get home, or tomorrow, there's pictures of it. It's absolutely amazing. A tunnel over 1/2 kilometre long that was dug from both ends without GPS, without modern surveying lasers and all the rest of it, carved through solid rock. And inside the tunnel, again, if you look on the internet, you'll see a picture of it. There's an inscription that was carved into the stone 2,500 years ago. And it says this, and this is the narrative of the tunnelling. Well, the picks, each toward his co-worker. And while there were still 3 cubits to tunnel through, the voice of a man was heard calling out to his co-worker, because there was a fissure in the rock running from south to north. And on the final day of tunnelling, each of the stonecutters was striking forcefully so as to meet his co-worker, pick after pick. And then the water began to flow from the source to the pool, a distance of 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stonecutters. For over 2,000 years, this tunnel and its inscription were completely hidden. Nobody knew about them. They were unknown to the world, apart from what the Bible recorded. It would have been easy to dismiss it as a myth or a legend, something that was impossible. But its rediscovery has shown us that the Bible is accurate in every detail. It's a record of real history. You probably remember more recently, I think it was about 2015, a document seal was found in the rubble under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And on it had an inscription which said, belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. In 1830, a clay prison was found in Nineveh, in the ruins of Nineveh, which records the conquests of the Assyrian ruler Sennacherib. And on it, Jerusalem and Hezekiah are named specifically, along with details of the siege that we're going to come on to in one of the later sermons. And the point I'm making, the point is that all of these artifacts show us that what we have in the Bible, what has been known for 2,500 years, if you'd only go and read it, is an accurate record of real history, of a place and a man that really existed. This is a man who was a real person, who thought about things, who ate and drank and had children and laughed and wept, who became ill, who prayed, who sinned. And as we go on in the series, it's just really important that we keep that in our minds. We're not reading here a kind of historical novel like Philippa Gregory or Hilary Mantel would write, where they take a little bit of historical fact that's known and they weave all sorts of stories around it and how the people were thinking and how they behaved. It's not padded out with fictional conjecture. All that the Bible tells us is accurate history of real people and their dealings with a real God. And as a consequence, what we read about and what we're going to consider is important and applicable to us, each of us. These are accounts of real people interacting with a real God, a God who doesn't change. The graciousness of God to this fallen man is the same graciousness with which he deals with each one of us. The just condemnation of his mistakes and sins is the same condemnation under which our failures must fall. But above that all, such a realisation must give us confidence to trust this book, God's book, to trust everything that it says, even those things which we can't, in a sense, go and dig up something to prove. Some today will tell us that this book is just a clever hoax. I used to share an office with somebody who said it was a hoax. He admitted it was a very clever hoax. But that was how he saw it, just a book that was written by people hundreds, thousand years after the events. For many years, the archaeologists were telling us that these guys, the Hittites that are mentioned in the Bible, they never existed. It was all just made up. There was no evidence for it. That was until 1876 when they found evidence of the Hittites. And since then, more evidence has emerged of this powerful people in the 15th and 16th centuries BC that align with what the Bible has been saying right from the beginning. If the Bible was made up, how could its writers have known these things? If it was written thousands of years later, or even hundreds of years later, how could the writers have known about these details that have been lost to history and only recently rediscovered? This is a book in which we must place and can place complete and utter confidence. Let's move on now to look at the man himself in a little bit more detail, and that's our second heading. Real history, real grace. By any measure, the outlook for this man is not good. His father, King Ahaz, he reigned for about 16 years until 716 BC. And 1 Kings tells us a little bit about this man in chapter 16. It says this: 20 years old was Ahaz when he began to reign. And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem, and he did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord his God, like David his father. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. Of course, remember, they'd gone off into all sorts of evil a lot sooner than the kings of Judah. But he followed them. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. Yes, he made his son to pass through the fire, according to the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord cast out from before the children of Israel. And he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places, and on the hills, and under every green tree. When he suffers defeat in battle, this father Ahaz, instead of crying to God for forgiveness, he buys help from the Assyrians. Where does he get the money from? He takes it from the temple. And Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and he sent it as a present to the king of Assyria. And then he goes to meet the Assyrian king in Damascus, and he sees a pagan altar there. So he notes down the design of it. He sends it on ahead of him and gets Urijah the priest to make a copy of it, so that when he gets back from Damascus, he, a king and not a priest, can go and offer on this pagan altar. That was Hezekiah's dad. That was the environment in which Hezekiah grew up. He would never have known anything else from birth in terms of outward expression of religion. And the passage I just quoted hints that even he caused Ahaz to pass through some sort of pagan ritual. It wasn't a very promising start for this young man, was it? You remember in Exodus 20 that the second commandment forbids the making of idols. and the worship of idols, with the specific warning that God will bring judgment upon the children of those that do those things, unto the third and fourth generations. Here's the first generation, Hezekiah. But by rights, he had nothing going for him, the worst of prospects. And yet God shows grace to this man. He saved him, not just from a life of idolatry, but eternally. He prospered him, he blessed him. He had a long reign. And as we shall go on to see, saw miracles of deliverance and even of physical healing. What grace God shows to those that are so undeserving. What grace, real grace, undeserved grace. God acting in a way that's totally unexpected and totally undeserved. And surely that's a lesson for us today. You imagine living through that reign of Ahaz, seeing that beautiful temple being stripped, being laid bare. Those things that had been made by the sacrificial giving of God's people, with skill and time and care to the glory of God, being given to a pagan king, bartered for mercenary soldiers. You'd look around from that great hill on which Jerusalem was, and everywhere you looked you'd see poles of idol groves set up on the tops of the hills. You'd see the smoke rising from idol sacrifices. Your friends and neighbours would be drawn into this false worship. And then King Ahaz dies. His son's taking over, the one that's grown up with this man. Is there any likelihood of change? Or is it just going to be more of the same? And yet change comes. Massive change. That has to be the grace of God, doesn't it? Let's not ask ourselves this. Do we really believe? Do we really believe that God can do that? And do we really believe that he can do it now, today, in this land of Wales? You know, we say that we do, but do we actually in our hearts, can we actually bring ourselves to believe that that can happen? Remember, Jesus said to a man, if you can believe, all things are possible to him that believes. He said this as well, Christ said this. Whatsoever things you desire, when you pray, believe that you will receive them, and you shall have them. So our question really is, do we really believe what God can do? I'm sure you know the story of William Tell. If you don't, I'll tell it to you afterwards. But he was a man who split the apple that was balanced on his son's head. He was a great hero in Switzerland. But just imagine you're there in the days of William Tell and you're in the crowd. And someone says to you, do you think that William can actually hit the apple on his son's head without killing his son? And you say, well, of course he can. He's the greatest archer in Switzerland. But then you see William beckoning to you. He says, I just need to have a bit of a practice before we actually go ahead with this. Would you mind standing against the wall with an apple on your head? I'm a bit rusty and I just need to make sure I'm okay with this. What do you believe now? Do you still believe he can do it? We have to examine our own hearts, I think, and ask what we really, truly believe God can do. But do remember this, that God isn't one of these vindictive deities that man invents. He's not a God who says, well, you didn't believe enough, and so I'm just going to cast you away. I'm going to turn my back on you. He gives grace, even in the most unpromising and unexpected places. That one to whom Christ said, all things are possible to him that believes. Well, what was his reply? You know it, don't you? Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. And Christ helped him. He did the impossible for that man. He healed his son. Christ gave him the belief, the faith, the grace that was lacking in him. We do need to believe. We do need to trust. But remember that God's grace transcends what we can do, what we can believe. You know what? We can never trust or believe enough. But God gives the grace that's all sufficient. Now we should thank him for that. Real history, real grace. Our third heading, real change. What we're going to go on to see in future weeks is that the grace and the working of God wasn't just a flash in the pan. It wasn't a short-term thing or even a small thing. It was massive. It was revolutionary. Look at what we read earlier in chapter 18. Speaking of Hezekiah, he removed the high places and brake the images and cut down the groves and break in pieces that brazen serpent that Moses had made. He trusted in the Lord God of Israel. He clave to the Lord and departed not from following him, but kept his commandments. And the Lord was with him and prospered him whithersoever he went. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not and smote the Philistines. What a difference to the reign of his father. And you know what? It changed Judah for a generation. It held back the judgment of God when those other 10 tribes were being marched off into captivity. That thing that happened during the reign of Hezekiah. He saw what was happening to those that didn't trust in God, and yet he trusted in God. And that trust held back that captivity that eventually came upon Judah. And here too, I think, is a lesson for today. On the evening of Sunday the 31st of December 1738, there was a prayer meeting. It began on the evening of the 31st of December, but it didn't finish on the evening of the 31st of December. It continued well into the early hours of the next day. And among those that were there that night and that morning was a man called John Wesley, and a man called Charles Wesley, and a man called George Whitefield. You've probably heard of them. And John Wesley recorded in his journal about that night, about 3 a.m, he said, as we were continuing instant in prayer, the power of God came mightily upon us, insomuch that many cried out for exceeding joy, and many fell to the ground. And as soon as we were recovered a little from that awe and amazement at the presence of his majesty, we broke out with one voice. We praise thee, O God. We acknowledge thee to be Lord. Imagine being there in Fetter Lane in London on New Year's Eve. There's to be a prayer meeting. Some people don't want to go because it's New Year's Eve. They've got other things to do. But you go. And the meeting starts. And it's just like every other prayer meeting you've ever been to. except that this one goes on and on and on and on. People were praying just like they always pray. Perhaps there were gaps and pauses. There are stuttering prayers and some passionate prayers and rambling prayers. You've been there a while and you hear the clocks in the town striking 11. You've been there 2 hours maybe. And you hear a bit of a creaking at the back, and a few people are getting up and going home. Midnight comes and goes, and perhaps a few more leave. Then 1 o'clock, and then 2 o'clock. And maybe somebody succumbs to sleep and you can hear a gentle snoring at the back. What are you thinking? How are you feeling? How much longer is this going to go on for? What's the point? Haven't we done this before? Did anything come of it? And the clock strikes 3, and you're ready to go home for bed for what's left of the morning. And then it happens. There's no warning. There's no precedent. God comes. The presence and the Spirit of Almighty God is known and felt. Are you still thinking about your bed? Wishing you'd gone home with the rest of them at 11 o'clock? You know, that gathering was later described as the prayer meeting that saved England. Why was that? Well, when France descended into that appalling anarchy and bloodlust of the French Revolution, 1789, even secular historians will tell us that the reason it didn't come to this country was the effect of the preaching of Whitefield and Wesley upon this nation. It was that prayer meeting that was the turning point in the lives of those men and enabled them to go out and to preach the gospel that changed this nation. Do we want to see real change in our country? I don't really need to ask the question, do I? Do we believe that real change can come? How will it come? Well, I'm a supporter of the Christian Institute, and I'm not knocking the Christian Institute, but change won't come through the Christian Institute and its work, much as I support that work and acknowledge it. I write occasionally to my MP on matters of importance, but change won't come that way either. It will only come in the way that it came in 1738 at that prayer meeting and in 715 BC. Not by the will or power of a king like Hezekiah, godly as he was, but by the will and power of the King. And it will come through prayer, real prayer. Not a prayer that lets us get away by 8:45, but prayer that says, I will not let thee go. I will not let thee go until thou bless me. I will not let thee go until thou bless me.